Hi, welcome back. In this session, we will set policies from API Manager. And we'll see how to set the client ID enforcement policy for the API that we have deployed in previous session from API Manager. And also we'll see how to request the access for the API, and we'll access the API by using the client credentials. So currently we are in Exchange. So employee API is the one that we have deployed in previous session, right? So now let's go to API Manager. Currently we are in Sandbox and we have deployed the application to Sandbox environment. So let's click on Employee API and check if it's active and currently running. Currently the application that we have deployed is active and we can use a proxy URL to access the API. Currently the API is running in Cloud Hub server. So we can run the API and get the successful response, or you can check the behavior of the API. This is working based on the API specification. Okay, we have query parameters. We don't have headers or authorization information needed to access the API. So any user can access the API without giving any authorization information. So it's available for all. So if we want to add some policy, if we want to set some policy and restriction for user to access the API, then we can come to API Manager and set the policy. You can select authentication 1, 2, or you can select client ID enforcement or basic authentication also. For now, let's set client ID enforcement policy. The API consumer must have client ID and client secret information in order to access the APIs. So let's apply this policy for all the API in the application. The policy is applied successfully. And now let's test the API again. It takes some time to reflect the changes. Let's wait for some time. And once the policy is applied, we should be able to get the error. We are getting unauthorized error because authentication informations are not given. As per the policy that we have set, the user should give client information, client credential information, right? The policy is enabled for this particular API. So let's check the configuration and see what exactly should be given. Header parameter should be given. The header client ID and client secret header should be given to access the APIs. So let's try to add the header information, client ID and client secret. Yeah. Okay. Let's try to call the API. We are getting invalid client now because we have the client ID and secret parameters, but we don't know what exactly should be given for this to be a valid client. So to be a valid client and access the API, we have to request the access and get the proper client credentials. So now currently we have deployed the version 1.0.1. and let's check what exact instance is deployed in Sandbox. So currently this is the instance that is deployed in the Sandbox, right? We can check the instance currently deployed, right? This is the instance for which we have to request the access, because there can be multiple environments like Sandbox, prod, stage or QA. So based on the instance and environment, you can request the access. For now, let's select the instance that we have deployed in Sandbox. Let's select the API instance and let's create some application. You can name it anything. Let's say testing employee API. Other fields are optional, we can neglect it. And let's try to request the access for this particular instance which is deployed in Sandbox. Now we got the client ID and secret information. So let's copy the client ID and client secret and we'll try to access. Now we are able to access the API with the client credentials. Now we have got the access to access the API that is deployed in sandbox environment, and we are successfully able to access the APIs. So this is the instance that we have used and got the request. If you want to get the access for different environments, you can select that particular instance and request for access. Now we got the client information, client credential information, and we are able to access the API successfully. Okay, this way we can set the policies, different policy. You can set the authentication to or the basic authentication where you can give the username and password. And if you want to block particular IPs, then you can set that as well. You can block the IP so that they will not be able to access the APIs. So now the client ID enforcement policy is set and we got the access, and we are able to access the API successfully by using the client credentials. Now let's go to employees API. From the exchange, we can check the details of the API, where the API consumer can understand more about the API. Here we can just see that we have a query parameters, but we have not mentioned anything about the header parameters. So now let's click on view code and do the changes. And for this API, currently we just have the query parameters. We have not mentioned anything related to headers. Client ID and client secret is the header needed to access the APIs, but those informations are not mentioned. So let's try to add the header information. Headers should have client ID and client secret, which was not there in the API specification. So let's add these information so that the API consumer will understand exactly what should be given as part of headers. Client secret, the type of the field is string, and let's add some example. This way the API users can understand the inputs that should be given for the API. Currently we have client ID and client secret added for as header parameters. Now let's publish the changes to exchange. Okay, these header parameters basically is generic. They are applicable for all the APIs that are present in this application. So let's create a trait so that we can reuse for different APIs. Now we have just get employees API. In future we can have multiple APIs, but this client ID informations, the header informations will be applicable for all the APIs. So let's create a trait with some name, client headers name, and we'll try to access through traits. Currently we just have the query parameters for get employees. So let's add headers as well. We'll use is keyword to access the traits, and now we are able to get the header information successfully. Now the header information is available. Yes, let's publish. Now the latest code changes should be available in the exchange. So let's refresh. Currently we have 1.0.1 and it should be updated with the latest information. Now the API will have the header information as well. Currently in the sandbox we have 1.0.1, the version that we have deployed previously. So let's go to the API manager and change the version to refer the latest API information. So let's change the version of the API, so that if you have new APIs added to the API specifications or did some major modifications, then the deployed API will have the latest information. Let's refresh, and now we can see that the version that we have changed is reflecting, and also the API will have the information needed, so that the API consumer will understand that they have to give the header information as well to give the client credential informations. So let's recall what we have done. We have set the client ID enforcement policy from API manager to the employee API, and also we have requested the access from API from Exchange for the particular sandbox instance, and also we have accessed the API by giving the client credentials. Thank you.